The village well and the flow of medieval water. The center of the village. When you picture a medieval village, you may imagine timber-framed houses, smoke curling from hearths, narrow lanes of mud or cobble, and perhaps fields stretching beyond the thatched rooftops. Yet at the center of so many villages, both large and small, stood something humbler, the well. A stone or wooden structure, sometimes little more than a hole reinforced with timber, sometimes enclosed with an elegant canopy. The well was one of the quiet foundations of medieval life. It was not dramatic, and yet it was essential. The well was where villagers gathered to draw water for cooking, drinking, washing, and brewing. You might imagine the steady rhythm of the bucket being lowered, the creak of rope, the splash as it struck the surface, and the heavy lift as it was pulled back up. Each sound was part of the daily soundtrack of life, familiar to every villager. The act of drawing water was not glamorous. It was repetitive and often tedious. But it was also communal. At the well, people exchanged news, discussed weather, or spoke of harvest prospects. It was both necessity and meeting place, an unplanned forum woven into daily life. The construction of wells required planning. Digging a well was arduous and dangerous, with collapses and suffocation posing real risks. When lined with stone, the walls of the well served not only to hold back the earth, but also to give a sense of permanence. A well might be repaired across centuries, its stones worn smooth by the constant rubbing of ropes. In some cases, wells were covered with wooden lids to protect them from contamination. In wealthier villages, or in monastic estates, wells might be fitted with carved stone surrounds and even roofs to protect them from weather. You must also imagine the effort of carrying water. A bucket of water is heavy, often more than 30 pounds when full, and had to be carried by hand, on shoulders, or with wooden yokes that distributed the weight. Every household relied on the labor of women, children, or servants to make these trips several times a day. A single pot of stew required water, as did brewing ale or washing linen. Even the animals in the yard needed watering. In this sense, the rhythm of life was tied to the well, its distance from the house shaping how much labor was required daily. Water was not always clean. Wells could easily be contaminated by waste pits dug too close, by animals wandering nearby, or by flooding that carried debris into the water. Villagers developed methods to cope, boiling when possible, brewing ale instead of drinking raw water, or using water only for cooking rather than drinking. Still, illness could spread when a well was fouled, and disputes sometimes arose over whose negligence was to blame. In medieval court rolls, you occasionally find fines recorded for those who allowed pigs to roam too close to a well, or for those who failed to maintain the lid that kept dirt out. Seasonal changes affected wells, too. In summer, water might run lower, requiring deeper draws, while in wet winters, wells sometimes overflowed or turned muddy. The reliability of a village's water source determined much of its security. A well that ran dry forced villagers to travel to nearby streams, rivers, or neighboring villages, a significant hardship in times of drought. Beyond the practical, the well carried symbolic meaning. In medieval thought, water had spiritual as well as physical significance. Wells were sometimes dedicated to saints, believed to have healing properties, or associated with local legends. Pilgrims might visit holy wells, collecting water in flasks. Even the ordinary village well could take on a sense of sacredness, for it sustained life daily. Blessings of wells are recorded in church rites, where priests prayed for protection against contamination and for the continued flow of clean water. Wells also represented order and community responsibility. Maintenance of the well was often a shared duty, decided at the manorial court or by village custom. When ropes frayed or stone linings collapsed, the community came together to repair them. Those who refused to contribute labor or material might be fined or shamed. In this way, the well became a quiet emblem of cooperation. No household could manage alone, for water was too central to survival. The rhythm of life at the well extended to its surroundings. Often, the well was placed in the village square or near the church, tying daily necessity to communal gathering. Around it, you might find benches or low walls, where buckets could be set down. Children played nearby while waiting for their turn. Animals might be tethered to posts while their owners fetched water. And so, the well was not just a source of water, but a site of life's ordinary interactions, repeating endlessly across centuries. In many ways, the story of the medieval well is the story of the unnoticed. No one chronicled the daily lowering of buckets, yet without it, life would have stopped. The drama of battles and kings may fill manuscripts, but without the quiet labor of drawing water, none of those events could have occurred. The well was the hidden infrastructure, mundane yet vital. And here is where the curiosity lies. If the well was so central, what happened when it failed? How did villagers respond when their water source was poisoned, dried, or destroyed by war? Did they abandon their homes? Or did they find new strategies to endure? Scarcity, contamination, and the strain of survival. In the first section, you stepped into the village square, where the well stood as both necessity and gathering place. You heard the creak of ropes, the splash of buckets, and the quiet exchanges that surrounded daily water drawing. But while the well embodied stability, it also carried risk. Water was life, but it was also fragile. Contamination, scarcity, and disputes over rights to a well could quickly unravel the steady rhythm of village life. When you think of water today, you might imagine taps and pumps, but in the medieval world, the well was vulnerable. A single dead animal falling in could render it unusable. A poorly placed latrine could leak filth into the water. A flood could wash in soil, manure, and debris, turning the bucket murky. Illnesses like dysentery, spread through contaminated water, were not understood in terms of bacteria, but people knew enough to notice patterns. Bad water made people sick. Some villages even recorded rules requiring that wells be covered, or that households keep their refuse at a distance. Failure to do so could result in fines levied by the manorial court. Scarcity was another threat. Wells depended on the groundwater beneath them, and in times of drought, the levels dropped. Buckets that once filled with a single pull might need to be lowered several times before they struck the water's surface. Villagers spoke of hungry wells, whose water seemed to vanish in summer. In those times, disputes over access sharpened. Who could draw first? How much was too much? Though villages were built on cooperation, thirst tested the bonds of community. Some households had private wells dug within their yards. These were convenient, but also controversial. In some villages, private wells were seen as unfair, cutting families off from the shared labor of the community. Yet for wealthier households, the convenience of water close at hand outweighed communal ideals. Records survive of legal cases where neighbors accused one another of stealing water from private wells, or of digging so close to another's property that the ground collapsed. Even the simple act of digging a hole for water could spark long-running disputes. In regions where groundwater was scarce, villages often relied on rivers or ponds instead. These water sources carried their own problems: mud, contamination from animals, or seasonal flooding. Wells were seen as superior, but not every village had the resources to dig deep enough or line the walls with stone. And so, the geography of a place often determined the reliability of its water supply. A well-maintained stone-lined well might last centuries. A shallow, timber-lined shaft might collapse within a generation. When wells ran dry or turned foul, villagers sought alternatives. Some walked long distances to springs or streams, carrying heavy buckets along rough paths. Others prayed at holy wells, believed to be protected by saints. In times of desperation, rituals were performed, priests blessing wells, villagers throwing offerings into water in hopes of renewal. Even though the logic of disease was not understood, the sense of sacredness around water meant that contamination was not merely a physical danger, but also a spiritual concern. Wells also figured in times of conflict. Armies passing through villages sometimes fouled wells deliberately, throwing carcasses or waste into them to deny water to their enemies. For a community dependent on a single source, this was devastating. Imagine the sudden silence when the bucket came up dark, foul-smelling, unusable. In such cases, survival meant seeking new sources or abandoning the settlement altogether. Beyond crisis, maintenance itself was constant work. Wells had to be cleaned, their linings repaired, their ropes replaced. Occasionally, men would be lowered down to clear debris or repair the stones. These were dangerous tasks. Stories of suffocation, drowning, or collapse circulated, adding a layer of quiet dread to the everyday dependence on wells. In some villages, those who maintained the well were respected for their skill, even if their labor was humble. Without their work, the bucket would bring up mud instead of water. Contamination and scarcity also shaped daily habits. Brewing ale became one of the most important strategies for safe drinking. By boiling water with grain and fermenting it, villagers transformed questionable well water into a safer, nourishing drink. Even children drank small ale, a weaker form. This reliance on brewing was not indulgence, but necessity, and it shaped the very rhythm of village life. Alehouses, monasteries, and households all brewed, and all relied on the well for their starting water. Thus, the safety of the well extended even into the tankards that sustained laborers in the fields. You might also consider the social aspect of scarcity. When a well ran dry, it was not only thirst, but also the unraveling of routines. The well was where people gathered, where news was exchanged, where disputes were smoothed over. Its absence was a hole in the community as much as in the ground. Villages without reliable water often dwindled or disappeared, their remains left as silent ruins. Archaeologists sometimes identify abandoned medieval settlements by the collapsed circles of their wells, overgrown and forgotten. In all this, the well became more than a source of water. It was a marker of resilience. When the rope snapped, it was replaced. When the stones fell, they were reset. When the water ran dry, villagers sought new sources. The struggle for clean, sufficient water was never glamorous, but it was continuous, shaping the patterns of survival. Yet one must ask, when scarcity and contamination were overcome, what legacy did the well leave behind? How did it influence not only survival, but the very culture of community, responsibility, and continuity in the medieval village? Legacy, memory, and the lasting role of the well. By now, you have walked with the villagers to the square, drawn water in heavy buckets, and watched disputes and dangers arise when scarcity or contamination struck. You have seen how the well was not only a physical resource, but also a fragile foundation of community life. In this final section, let us look more closely at what the well meant in the long arc of medieval society, not merely as a hole lined with stone, but as a structure of memory, identity, and endurance. The first thing to consider is longevity. Wells were often the most enduring features of a settlement. Houses of timber and thatch could rot or burn. Fences and barns collapsed within decades. But wells, when lined with stone, could last centuries. Even when villages were abandoned, whether through plague, war, or shifting land use, the well remained. Archaeologists often find medieval wells as silent markers of where life once clustered. In this way, the well became a kind of anchor. Even when people moved, the well marked where community had once stood. In living communities, the well was woven into cycles of time. Villagers measured their days and trips to fetch water, in the routine of filling jars at dawn or carrying buckets at dusk. The sound of creaking rope or splashing buckets became part of the rhythm of life. This quiet repetition was not dramatic, but it gave shape to the passing of time in a world without clocks or schedules as we know them. The well was not just a source of water. It was a measure of life's predictability. Symbolically, the well became linked with ideas of purity, renewal, and continuity. Many wells were blessed during church festivals, their waters sprinkled during rites of protection. The idea that water connected earthly survival with spiritual grace gave the well a significance beyond its practical role. Villagers sometimes decorated wells with greenery at midsummer or performed rituals to mark the return of water after droughts. These were not grand ceremonies, but small, persistent reminders that the well was both practical and sacred. You might also think of the stories that gathered around wells. In some places, legends developed of wells that never ran dry, or of holy men who struck the ground and caused water to spring forth. These tales often attached to very ordinary village wells, giving them an air of mystery. The well, then, became a bridge between daily drudgery and the imagination, a place where practical labor touched myth. The social role of the well persisted as well. Because all villagers needed water, the well was one of the few spaces where everyone met, regardless of wealth or status. The lord's household, the peasant's family, the blacksmith, and the widow, each stood in line with buckets, each subject to the same necessity. Though inequalities persisted in every other part of medieval life, the well was a place of shared dependence. This is perhaps why disputes over wells were so sharp. They cut to the heart of community fairness. To foul the well or monopolize it was not only selfish, but also a breach of shared trust. As time passed, technology slowly shifted. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, some towns developed more advanced water systems, conduits of lead or wood that carried spring water into urban centers, or cisterns that collected rainwater. Yet even then, the well did not disappear. In villages and smaller towns, it remained central. Even in cities, public wells continued to function as communal gathering points, supplemented but not replaced by new methods. The persistence of wells also shaped later institutions. When universities, hospitals, and monasteries developed, they too often had wells or cisterns at their centers. The daily act of drawing water, shaped over centuries of rural life, carried into these new settings. In this way, the humble village well influenced larger structures of society. But perhaps the most important legacy of the well is how it reminds us of the ordinary foundations of history. Great events, wars, treaties, inventions, often dominate our imagination. Yet none of them could occur without the daily survival of ordinary people. And that survival depended, in large part, on something as unremarkable as a bucket lowered into a stone shaft. Without wells, there was no bread, no ale, no livestock, no life. The well sustained the background upon which history was written. When you look back at the medieval well now, you might find it dull, a practical necessity, little more. But pause a moment. Think of the generations who stood by it, the thousands of hands that pulled ropes, the voices that echoed in conversation, the silences that fell when drought struck. The well was a constant presence in lives otherwise filled with uncertainty. Crops might fail, lords might change, armies might march, but the well was there. In that quiet endurance lies its significance. And yet, this leaves you with a question. If something as ordinary as a well could shape the life and memory of a community, what other unnoticed structures of medieval daily life, ovens, markets, barns, or even footpaths, might reveal themselves as hidden anchors of history if we only pause to consider them?